This lecture turns from ancient Egypt in North Africa and looks to the Aegean Sea and the civilizations that would develop there in a prehistoric and ancient period that we will discuss today, specifically with the Cycladic style and the Minoan. Now, the prehistoric Mediterranean and Aegean is going to overlap the time period that we were discussing between the pyramids to King Tut. This is the civilization that directly precedes the rise of ancient Greece as a lone superpower in the West under Alexander the Great. The heroes of this generation are recounted in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and it wasn't until 1870 that they were regarded as anything except for myth. The Aegean civilization that we'll discuss today disappeared by the Archaic period and the poet Homer's time, so these individuals were transformed into a golden age of heroes, not thought to be flesh and blood and historically living individuals. Not until Heinrich Schliemann discovered the 13th century BCE city and ruins of Troy in modern-day Turkey. The discovery reinforced the existing Greek historians who had claimed that the Trojan War had taken place at the end of the 12th century BCE. Eratosthenes, for instance, is going to be one who states that the war lasted a decade, as described by Homer in the Iliad, and lasted from 1194 until 1184 BCE, culminating with the Trojans bringing the horse into the city with the Greek troops inside, thus ending this decade-long conflict. Now, how do we know about the civilizations that actually existed during the time in which Homer's Iliad is set? And the answer is we do have a written language. We have the Aegean documents written in different types of writing, Linear A and Linear B. This is a precursor to ancient Greek. But unfortunately, we have only managed to translate one of the three primary types of Linear A and B to this date. And so we do not have still a clear understanding of the actual civilization, only what was handed down in the oral tradition by way of myth. Now, the prehistoric Aegean is going to be named as such because not for its period of time in which it takes place, but instead the cultural development for the islands of the Cyclades, of course named as such because they form a circle around the island of Delos, are going to have not yet invented writing. So we are still in prehistory by way of cultural development. What we know about the Cyclades that will foretell the Greeks and their passion for traveling and trade is that they have abundant marble quarries, but very little land in order to produce an abundant amount of agriculture and or grow large numbers of cattle on. So they had to learn how to trade early on in the civilization span. Here we find the Cyclades are just going to be to the east of the Peloponnesus and the main Greek mainland cities, and just north of Crete, where the Minoan civilization will rise here shortly. Now, the art that we find in Cycladic culture is going to be one that is highly geometricized and generally depicting women who are found in the graves of this culture and their people. Here, the figurine of a woman from Syros in the Cyclades from 2600 to 2400 BCE is going to be a good example of the type of sculpture we find in this area. Because we find two women here, different sizes, are going to have their arms folded over their chest, their legs pressed together tightly, as though they are going to be laid to rest in a grave. Now, these are going to be highly prized today, but only since the early 20th century, with the advent of modernity and modern sculpture, because they look like they foretold the abstract sculpture that will become common in movements such as Futurism, Cubism, and others. So we find that artists flocked to museums that now had Cycladic art in the ancient Mediterranean areas to study them, to see how to flatten out and or abstract the human form. Styles like that found in the Cyclades would in fact inspire modern abstraction like Cubism and other movements, helping artists understand how to abstract the human form, looking to the past for these solutions. So in the work, of course, the makers, the creators of these statuettes did not intend to be abstracting from the human form in an avant-garde fashion to depart from reality. These are used very specifically in the culture for its believed rites of passage and to mark important milestones in one's life. They are also going to mostly be representing nude women, not men with their arms folded. So we find that they're carved in marble with an obsidian, that being a volcanic glass scraper, and then polished to be very smooth at the end using emery stones. These are found in both graves and settlements in the Cyclades, in the surrounding islands, and so we know that they were used for different purposes, not only funerary purposes, but to also mark different occasions. Here's another example from 2500 to 2300 BCE, this one in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, and this one's just over a foot high. In it, we have a female figure that was placed with her back in the grave, lying down as though she was deceased and prepared for the next life. It is only a half-inch thick, and so it is very wide yet quite thin. And it is schematized or geometricized into the shapes of a triangle. So we have these overlapping triangular forms and features that direct and dictate the form of the figure. Of course, the inverted pubic triangle ensures that we understand this figure is female, as does the protruding breasts and, of course, the vulva. Now, these are not always found in women's graves, however. They are going to extend the same type of poses and the same type of figures in both men and women's cultural experiences at the time. Now, originally, these would have been painted blue, red, and green, which we know from infrared reflectography and microscopy. You can see remnants of red paint over the left breast of the main figure here, for instance. So we find that the figures, are they in fact representing fertility? That being, are they trying to encourage fecundity in this culture? Are they goddesses and or otherwise very important and or religious figures that we would pray to control our world spiritually or to pray to upon death? We know that they're trying to emphasize that they're feminine because we're focusing on the same aspects that early man has since the Paleolithic age with the Venus of Willendorf. We have swelling breasts, an emphasized pubic area, a belly that is also protruding and swelling, and it was painted. Here you see remnants of a red swath of paint moving from the top right to the lower left of the torso. If we overlay geometric shapes onto these figures, we can see how they're going to be bound by this repeated schematization and or geometricization. It's a way in which for early man to understand the world by imposing patterns on it, shapes on it. Now here is the most elaborate sculpture that we have found in the Cyclades, which is not female, but a male figure that is going to be playing, right, this duck-billed ornament, most likely a stringed ornament like a lyre or a harp. He is also schematized into these flat planes and or cylinders, and is found again in a grave. So, are we in fact playing music for the deceased in the afterlife who's in the grave with us? Then we would understand this as being the same function as the bull-headed lyre from the king's grave at Ur from 2600 BCE in the Sumerian culture. Again, we find that attendant musicians in the afterlife are common among many ancient Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultures. But we still do not know exactly the function of this or the other Cycladic sculptures because unlike ancient Sumeria and the bull-headed lyre seen to the left, we have not decoded or understood the writing of these early Aegean cultures yet. So both of these are in fact going to be found in women's graves, but they obviously have different meanings. Now, the context is also significant. Obviously, they cannot both represent the deceased because one is male and one is female. So we must look to other cultures to understand what they could have been suggesting by putting these figures in the ground with the deceased. One of the most dominant theories, if we look at the painting remnants of it on each figure, is that at different stages of one's life, your figurine would be painted in different areas, such as drawing eyes on the abdomen when one becomes pregnant or when one's wife becomes pregnant, or going through adolescence, getting your menses, and or going through puberty, becoming a man. All of these stages would require different colors of paint on different parts of the body because different parts of the body would be affected at different times of one's life. Turning now to the prehistoric Aegean, a civilization that we do have a written record for, but do not understand all of it yet, is the Minoan civilization. So Minoan comes from King Minos, who is going to be the king who is the offspring of Zeus and Europa. And this is the story where Zeus is going to transform himself into a beautiful white bull and present a flower from his snout, seducing the beautiful Europa and taking her out into the sea. He swims so far out that she can no longer see the edge of the Peloponnesus, and they wind up on Crete. He transforms back into his godly anthropomorphic form, makes love to her, and 9 months later, King Minos is born. Now, Crete is going to rise as the dominant superpower in the Mediterranean at this time. So we find that when we see the decline of Egypt, Crete is rising as a trading center that's going to be ruled by an oligarchy. Now, Sir Arthur Evans in 1910 discovers the palace that he believes is going to be that of King Minos, not knowing that they had a different form of government because he did not translate their writing as of yet. But as with every one of these archaeological discoveries we've discussed, the archaeologists of the late 19th and early 20th century primarily are focused on either proving the archaeological evidence true or false in the Bible or discovering massive tombs or castles or palaces relating to historical kings, very important monarchs, not lower class or middle class settlements. That's not what their primary focus is. So they are blinded by the fact when they find something that it must be, as they would have suspected with confirmation bias, a palace for a king. Here, the palace at Knossos at Crete, he believes is going to be the palace for King Minos because it resembles a maze in the lower levels. Now, why would maze-like structures have suggested King Minos? And the answer is the story relating to Theseus and the Minotaur. Now, everyone knows the Minotaur, that being the head of a bull on the body of a man, a grotesque beast that was fed virgins to devour alive in human sacrifice periodically from the Greek mainland. Now, how we get to the Minotaur is an interesting story because King Minos makes an agreement with Poseidon to sacrifice his best bull every year. Only one year a bull was born that was so perfect, so beautiful, that he could not bear to part with it. So he sacrifices a lesser bull instead. We find that Poseidon, of course, then states, if you love your bull so much, I'm going to make your queen fall in love with the bull. So Pasiphae falls madly in love with this bull that's King Minos' queen. She comes to Daedalus, the greatest craftsman and inventor of the ancient world, and asks him to construct her a hollow cow costume to climb into, so that the bull could then have congress with her and impregnate her. 9 months later, the Minotaur is born. The bull of Minos, literally, is what it translates. So here is a later painting from Pompeii of the bull costume or the cow costume that Pasiphae is climbing into in order to make love to the bull. This is the punishment of King Minos for trying to trick or betray a god. So we find that King Minos demanded 14 youths from Athens to feed the Minotaur on lunar cycles. We find that Theseus is going to be the prince of Athens, who is going to succeed in slaying the Minotaur with Ariadne's help, Ariadne being the daughter of Queen Pasiphae and King Minos. She betrays her parents and helps Theseus to slay the Minotaur by giving him a clue, which is a ball of yarn that he uses to find his way back out of the labyrinth, the house of the double axes for sacrificial slaughter. He then, of course, takes her back to Athens, but drops her off on the island of Naxos and leaves her to die en route. Because she betrayed her father, she would not make a good wife in the Greek tradition and belief system. Now, the belief that they had found this maze, this labyrinth in which the Minotaur would have been kept, designed by Daedalus to punish those that were going to challenge the king, is going to be an amazing discovery that Sir Arthur Evans hopes he has made. However, this is not a palace because Crete was not ruled over by a monarchy or a king, but instead by an oligarchy. And they did not live here, therefore it could not be a palace even for oligarchs. This was instead a economic repository or trading center. In this economic center, we do not have large areas for individuals to live or to sleep or to eat for that matter. There are some domestic quarters generally thought to be used for traveling salesmen or tradesmen that are going to be moving about selling their wares. What we primarily find is going to be these storerooms for goods that are going to then be exchanged in this economic center. Now there are tripartite shrines and or areas to pray to the gods for a safe passage and or to bless your commerce. But these are not very large open air structures for altars and or for public worship. These are private small areas. Now, the decorations that we find here at Knossos tell us a good deal about the civilization on Crete. They're going to be built up over a series of centuries, from 1700 to 1400 BCE. We have the Bronze Age building over the original Neolithic structures that originally existed, in some areas 4 stories high. Now, the mud bricks are going to be faced with a local stone that has been dressed and or carved in order to fit more seamlessly in with other stones next to it. An earthquake in 1700 BCE, we know, destroyed a good deal of the structure, and the entire center is going to be repaired and enlarged thereafter. The complexity and maze-like confusion of the building is due to these reconstruction efforts in which there are passageways that do go nowhere because they did not dig out all of the refuse and rubble from the previous earthquake, merely building new passageways and ways around the palace or the economic center. Here is the area in the lower sections showing you that ventilation and lighting is going to be provided by clerestories, an invention that they would have gotten from their exchanges with the Egyptian civilization, trading with their neighbors just to the south a few miles of the island of Crete. In these lower sections and what is supporting the clerestory, we find timber that is used to retrofit the building to ensure that a future earthquake would not cause catastrophic damage again. Because it is flexible, the wood is going to bend in the case of an earthquake. And so we find here we also have the precursor to Greek Doric order columns that are upside down. We find that most of the weight and girth of the column is at the top, not the base. But obviously, this is a civilization that directly precedes the ancient Greeks, and so their knowledge, their styles and architectural design would be passed on to this next civilization. Decorations in the palace reveal that, like the ancient Mediterranean and Mesopotamian civilizations before them, the Cretans or Minoans are going to worship bulls, and as part of a rite of passage that continues in the Mediterranean culture today, young men, to prove their virility and that they have achieved manhood, would perform acrobatic feats with bulls. Here, the bull leaping fresco that has been restored at the Palace of Knossos is one of the most famous. It is a mural that covers an entire wall, but it is going to be painted in buon fresco, or good fresh, or wet lime plaster. Many of the sections do not survive, and so have been reconstructed here. Now, the idea of fighting a bull and or performing daring feats around it is nothing new, and we see it especially in Spanish culture and in Italian culture today, where we'll have matadors fighting bulls, and or actual bull leaping still exists, where individuals will leap over charging bulls, showing their masculinity and fearlessness. In the flying gallop here, we have this highly stylized understanding of the bull and the two women and men in this painting. For this funnel of energy is going to find the figures have pinched waists to suggest that they are moving relatively rapidly. So we are not trying to show them anatomically correct. We are not trying to suggest the proper linear perspectival or atmospheric perspective understanding of the scene, but instead to suggest liveliness, vivacity. The long hair of the figures also cascading down appropriately like this funnel that's going to be pushing the bull forward, that is held by the horns by this woman who's going to be all the way to the left. So the curvilinear lines and elasticity of form is indicative of the Minoan civilization, who will prize bright colors, liveliness, vivacity, motion, and movement. This is what they value, that they will pass on to the ancient Greeks, an appreciation for liveliness and action, instead of permanence that we find in the Egyptian civilization. Now, in the restored lighter areas, you can see that the male and female figures are going to be shown differently. For going back to the Sumerian civilization and then the Egyptian civilization we just discussed, women are going to be shown as having ochre-colored skin or lighter complexions than their male counterparts. Men are generally going to be shown as dark and ruddy to indicate that they are outside more, that they are exposed to the sun more, and that their professions are going to take them in the public sphere of life. This is going to be true in the painted decoration and polychrome statues in ancient Egypt as well. Here we find two women off to the side, just like the bull leaping ceremony here, with two men embracing in the middle. The Minoans are going to worship many different deities. They are not a monotheistic civilization, and they will pass this on to the ancient Greeks. Here, the snake goddess, one of a type that we find many of in the Cretan civilization, the ancient Minoan civilization. We have a woman or a goddess with snakes that is found in the Palace of Knossos in one of these shrines for worship. So the belief with this figure that is over a foot tall, that it is probably a goddess, is going to be made clear by way of the snake she's holding and the leopard sitting on her head. Not to mention the exposed breasts that she has in her wonderfully colorful garment here. So this is reconstructed from a tripartite shrine which would have had 3 different deities in it. This is faience, a colorfully glazed pottery to suggest the colorful decorations and the types of clothing that women would have worn. Now the dress that she's wearing is going to be multi-sectioned, and when she would spin or move in space, they would flare out. So these brightly colored dresses would catch one's eye and are designed for maximum motion. The figure is going to be found in a shrine, much like those earlier Sumerian statuettes who look up. But now we find she controls aspects of nature. She's going to be holding snakes. She has a leopard on her head. And mortals do not generally control wild animals in such a way, so it is believed that this is going to be a water goddess that controls these aspects of life in the wilderness. So this is the most common type of statuette that we find in Minoan civilization, your female holding serpents. So again, the regenerative power of femininity and the protection of the home relates in the Greek and Roman civilizations to women as well. Nymphs are going to still be associated with freshwater springs, and we find that the goddess of the hearth and home will be Hestia or Vesta in the Roman tradition. Now, this is not monumental. We find no monumental statues, in fact, in the Minoan civilization. The exposed breasts and the wild animals show us that she has a mastery of the animal world, which would be appropriate for a deity, and will be passed on in goddesses like Artemis for the ancient Greeks. Now here we have the ancient Egyptian, Sumerian, and Minoan civilizations seen in a series of statues. So what the Minoans are going to adopt from the Egyptians is going to be the frontality of the presentation of figures and the large emphasis placed on eyes, these large staring eyes. What is unique to them, however, is the costume and motion. That being, the figures are going to be in open poses, lifting their limbs, snakes writhing in them. Brightly painted are the costumes that they wear. And so this becomes the hallmark for the Minoans: liveliness, vivacity, action. Here we have another one of these statuettes from the island of Palakastro on Crete, the Palakastro youth. It is going to be a sculpture carved of ivory with gold leaf on the surface, giving it a rather incandescent and or spiritual appearance. Now these materials are going to be imported from Egypt, and he would have been displayed alone in a shrine like the gods before, or the snake goddess we just looked at. This will also form the core for ancient Greek religious worship, where you'll find one god or goddess in a shrine to worship at the same time. Just like when we get to the Parthenon, you would have one cult statue inside of the Parthenon, and that is dedicated to Athena. So you would have had one goddess. This comes from the Minoans, who have one god in a shrine. The frontality here of the Palakastro youth is going to be taken from the Egyptian civilization, as is his posture, which is going to have his left foot forward and right foot back. His fists, however, are now raised up to his chest in a more open pose and an active pose. We also find that his head is shaved and he has a central braid. And there is much more attention paid to the musculoskeletal system, as we find the muscle groups are outlined, as are the veins in the figure. This is distinctly Minoan, as we see here an image of a young woman as well. Both men and women would shave their hair and braid it into a central braid in the center until reaching puberty, and then women would let their hair grow out. In each one of these, we have what will become the basis for Greek art, an interest in liveliness, in anatomical correctness, and once again, bringing everything they have learned to bear from other civilizations into something new and unique. So ancient Aegean art is modeled on ancient Egyptian art, but with a much greater interest in liveliness, anatomy, and motion. This leads to a radical stylistic evolution in ancient Greece, in which every generation a new style will emerge to refine and reflect on what their ideal is. and that ideal is going to be the perfect individual. Next class, we'll continue on with Mycenaean art and supposedly the citadel of Agamemnon, discovered on the Greek mainland.